Kingdom of Men, Chapter 4, Attacked. KaLeah finished eating the celebratory dinner and then sat quietly with her hands in her lap, nervously rubbing the smooth red fabric of her dress. Princess Amira finished eating a strawberry tart with chocolate flakes and then gently dabbed her mouth with a napkin, turned, and smiled vibrantly at KaLeah. "Follow me, dear KaLeah," she said, bouncing up from her chair. A servant standing almost directly behind her pulled out her chair in one fluid motion as Amira stood. KaLeah was left to scoot her chair out on her own. Princess Amira placed her hand gently on KaLeah's lower arm and led her down from the table and into the ballroom. She shadowed that little lady in pink, nodding and smiling politely when the princess introduced her to group after group of polished people. As they moved from one small party to another, Amira took the time to quietly inform KaLeah of details concerning the guests. Some were wealthy families, shop owners, family members of generals, captains, and others who ran in the more affluent circles. Amira told her about a smaller selection of friends and confidants to the royal family, who were more like distant relatives and referred to as favors, or the favor families. They had been gifted with the title for certain favors they and their families had performed for the royal family over the years. KaLeah didn't see Prince Nicolot again that evening. She was exhausted and relieved when the night finally came to an end. Back in the room-sized closet, the nurse maids were waiting to help the girls disrobe. When the nurses finally pulled the dress off her, KaLeah felt like a snake shedding its skin. The ladies then dressed KaLeah in a comfortable, long, ivory nightgown. She felt silly at first, but then decided it was better than the red dress and would be more comfortable to sleep in than her hunting clothes. With a household full of guards, it wasn't likely that she would need to jump out of bed fully dressed and prepared for danger. The ivory gown would have to do for now, at least, while she slept at the castle for another night or two. Once her feet were slipped into comfortable slippers, she excused herself from the company of the ladies and found her way back to her room. She noticed immediately that the doors of her wooden armoire were open, and hanging inside was an assortment of dresses and riding outfits. She moved the pieces from side to side, realizing that there were more articles in front of her than she had possessed over her entire life. A knock on the door startled her. Her first thought was that it was a mistake. "Who is it?" she called out. "Servant to Prince Nicolot with a letter for the Lady KaLeah." She was at the door in 2 steps. "I'm KaLeah," she said, swinging open the thick door. The servant's eyes were downcast and red, his hair and shirt disheveled as if he'd just been pulled out of a deep sleep. She took the letter from his scrawny hand, thanked him, and retreated into her room to read it. She walked to a small table and held it beneath the light of a candle flame. "Lady KaLeah, Prince Nicolot requests your presence at his chambers." KaLeah read it a few more times, and a strange sensation filled her stomach, as if she might be sick. She didn't know what the Prince of Bellerone could possibly need to see her about, but she knew better than to keep standing there dumbfounded. She assumed that her night dress was more for sleeping and perhaps inappropriate to wear for a meeting with a prince. She reached into the closet and selected what she hoped to be a more comfortable dress than the one she'd worn earlier. It was one of the less vibrantly colored ones, at least, a pale shade of blue. She shook her head at herself while she changed, surprised she even had to think such things about garments. She changed quickly, leaving the night slippers on her feet, and then left her room. She asked a guard at the end of the corridor for instructions on finding the prince's chamber. She expected a look of judgment, but he didn't even look at her as he gave her directions. Her mind started to wonder about why Prince Nicolot would request to see her. Perhaps, since he'd stayed hidden all night, he wanted to formally thank her for saving his sister. Maybe he was suspicious of her and wanted to confirm her reasons for being there. Of course, KaLeah thought, "I don't want to be here." That would be an easy answer for her. The prince was a rather attractive man and had looked at her very intensely that evening. What if he wants to see me because he likes me? KaLeah wondered, and then quickly pushed the thought aside, saying to herself out loud, "Don't be ridiculous." She had known many boys and men who had courted women back in her village. Though never directly involved, KaLeah had seen flowers given, kisses stolen, and smiles so big it must have made their cheeks hurt. She had seen the love pass between couples' eyes back in her village, but she had never known it herself, and was sure she never would. Admittedly, she had probably watched the exchanges of affection a little too closely. Hugs, kisses, and the words, "I love you," were all unknown experiences. She thought back to when Princess Amira had first hugged her, and the strange sensation. It was so unfamiliar that it had been a shock to her. Her father had never hugged her or even kissed her as a child, as she had seen some fathers do. She wondered if there was something about her that all men, including her father, disliked enough to keep from even hugging her. After seeing Nicolot earlier, she partly hoped that this was some sort of formal request and tried to keep herself from getting her hopes up about a boy, a young man, actually being attracted to her. KaLeah had almost reached Nicolot's door when she heard footsteps behind her in the hall. She grabbed for her dagger and then remembered that she hadn't thought to bring it. She hadn't needed any weapons since her arrival at the castle. Back at her home in the village, there'd always been weapons within easy reach. Her father was very aware and always watched out windows, as if a threat were continually lurking. She had adopted that cautious energy as her own, but being in the castle the last few days had started to lull her into a calm sense of security. She spun around to face her intruder, hands out in front, ready to grab, claw, or choke. "Calm down, old girl." The man's voice was thin and high. She recognized him as the man who had been standing with Nicolot in the ballroom. He looked even more ghastly up close. "Who are you?" KaLeah asked. "I'm Favor Lamone, a friend of Prince Nicolot, and the entire royal family, of course," he said, bowing slightly. "The prince has requested my presence. Please excuse me." KaLeah lowered her hands. "Tut, tut, girl," he said, taking a few steps closer. "The prince did request you, but only as a special favor to me. After I saw you this evening, I just had to meet you and, well, get to know you better." His intention slid with his eyes down the length of her body. Lamone reached out a hand to touch her cheek, and she pulled back fast, slapping his hand away. He looked stricken and grabbed his spindly fingers as if they had been broken. Then he narrowed his eyes and squared up his shoulders. "You have no choice, girl," he said. "By order of Prince Nicolot, you are to be mine for tonight, maybe every night from this one on." KaLeah's stomach muscles tightened. She wasn't sure which was worse, that this disgusting man was propositioning her, or that Nicolot hadn't wanted to see her after all. If she had been in possession of a blade, it would have found its way into this man's heart. She figured that it would be possible to seriously injure him with one swift kick to his groin, but logic overcame her fighting response. She knew that she was a guest, and he was a favor. Whatever that status truly meant, she was sure she was below it. So, instead of kicking him, she turned and stormed to Nicolot's door. She pounded on the door, eyeing the guards that stood passively to either side. After a few moments, she heard more footsteps and assumed they belonged to Nicolot. Lamone was still talking, but her ears were burning so hot she couldn't hear him. The door opened, and soft candlelight flooded into the hallway from Nicolot's room. Nicolot eyed her with a hint of humor on his face. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned all his weight on one foot. "The famous Lady KaLeah. I wondered if I might see you tonight," he said smoothly, as if everything were all right. Now KaLeah squared up her own shoulders. Lamone squeezed up behind her. "Your Highness," she said, and narrowed her eyes into a glare, "Favor Lamone has come to me tonight as a buyer of property. Unfortunately for him, I am not owned by anyone. I'm here as a guest of your sister. I am not a slave or a concubine for this kingdom or anyone residing within its walls. With all due respect, I am the sole owner of my body and it is not for sale." The moments passed painfully slow. KaLeah became increasingly embarrassed and a little frightened for speaking so directly to a prince. The thought of discussing her body sexually also made her a little dizzy. She watched Nicolot carefully. His face turned from humored to thoughtful. He unlocked his arms and reached out to grab KaLeah's shoulders. She jumped, but didn't resist when he pulled her into his room. Lamone followed. Nicolot spoke to Lamone without taking his eyes or hands off KaLeah. "She's right, Lamone. Your request is denied by the owner, and I deny it. Return to your chambers." "But Prince, you—" "Silence! I am revoking my permission. I believe my brother keeps concubines in the castle. See him about fulfilling your request."
"But you filled my request, sire," Lamone said, tightening his jaw. "She's just a villager, and she must obey your command."
Nicolot turned sharply then and looked Lamone squarely in the eye. "And so do you," he said, emphasizing each word. Lamone held the prince's glare for a moment and then dropped his head, pushed past them, and stormed out of Nicolot's doors. The guards standing in the hallway watched him leave and then shut the doors behind him. "Forgive me, KaLeah," Nicolot said, squeezing her shoulders affectionately. He finally released her, and she just stood there, frozen. KaLeah stared up into his glassy, gray-blue eyes. Her stomach started to spin, and she suddenly wished his hands were back on her shoulders to steady her. "Why did you promise me to him?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly as she regained her composure. He turned from her and walked toward his window. "Because he asked," he said simply. "What am I to do? Deny my friend something he wants?" "Yes," she said. She was feeling braver with his back to her. "You absolutely deny him what he wants when what he wants is me, or any girl, for that matter." He scoffed. "Well, aren't you noble?" he said. "You must be a lonely girl so far from home." KaLeah couldn't believe he was attempting to justify his actions. He moved to sit down in a chair. "I thought you might enjoy a little male company." "Well, I don't. And you shouldn't make assumptions about a person you don't know," she said. "Whatever you say," he said. He laced his fingers together in front of his face and avoided her eyes. She had a feeling he was hiding something, and he wasn't even in the conversation at all. Unspoken questions began to swirl in her head. Why did he pull me into his room? Why hasn't he dismissed me? Why is he holding eye contact so intensely? Why did he change his mind? She told herself that it didn't matter. She did not know this person, and prince or not, she owed him nothing. She gave a slight bow and headed to the door. "Good night, Prince." He said nothing, and she let herself out. That night, KaLeah had a dream. In her dream, she was standing on top of a rocky mountain overlooking a kingdom she had never seen before. In fact, she'd never seen or heard of towers like these, stacked so closely together and spread across the land. Lights, much brighter than candlelight, seemed to light up every corner of each tower. Above her, the sky was filled with flying dragons. There were dragons all around, and they were screaming at her. She couldn't put the sounds together into sensible words. Then a large dragon flew straight at her, chomping its jaws, and she woke up. The dream stayed with her as she washed her face and selected a riding outfit from the closet. She dressed in a gray pair of riding pants and a light green tunic. She was pleased to see various sets of riding boots in her size. She selected a black pair. As she headed to the door, the dream stayed with her like a fog. She could see the dragon's jaws and hear them clamping together repeatedly. The way the dream stayed with her gave her an eerie feeling that it had been more of a premonition than a dream. The mood of the dream made her grab her sword on her way out, as if to protect herself from the dragon spirits themselves. Princess Amira was in a particularly cheery mood that morning as they headed toward the dining hall. She was in a pink and white riding outfit and was chattering about the day ahead, but KaLeah wasn't really listening. Her eyes absently scanned the dragon murals that decorated almost every wall in the castle, as if she was looking for something. Then she saw one that made her freeze in mid-stride. Amira stopped too.
What's wrong? Amira asked. What are you looking at?
KaLeah stared at a mural depicting a scene similar to the one in her dream. A warrior was standing on top of a mountain. He was surrounded by dragons, flying around him, as if he commanded them. I think I dreamt about this tapestry last night. It seems so familiar to me. Amira stepped closer to the mural. She took a deep breath and then raised one eyebrow.
Huh, I wonder what she's doing. I've never paid much attention to these tapestries.
She? KaLeah asked. She stepped closer and looked at what she thought was a man with long hair. But Amira was right. The figure was a woman on the mountain, surrounded by dragons, just like she had dreamed.
You must have seen this walking through the castle and then dreamt about it,
Amira said. She reached for KaLeah's hand and pulled her down the hallway. Much to KaLeah's dismay, Prince Nicolot was in the dining room waiting for them. "Good morning, ladies," he said. He was dressed in varying shades of black. A long black sleeveless vest hung over tight black pants secured with a black belt. He had on a V-neck shirt that hung so loosely that most of his chest was exposed. He wore long black arm guards on both arms. His biceps bulged out, and KaLeah couldn't help but notice his bare arms and chest. She felt dumb for looking, especially once she noticed that Nicolot was staring just as intensely at her, her cheeks flushed with heat. "I was hoping you two would accompany me riding this morning after breakfast," Nicolot said.
Of course we will, brother,
Amira said.
Won't that be fun, KaLeah? We were planning on riding anyway.
KaLeah pulled her hard gaze away from Nicolot and gave Amira a soft look. She smiled at the little girl and said nothing. "I am just spending a few days here to make her happy, and then I am leaving," she reminded herself. She was not about to give up the chance to ride a draggot again. After they finished their large breakfast, they walked together through the castle and out into the sunshine. The planet Denlarak hung heavy in the sky above, with hints of gray and brown streaming across its face. KaLeah tried to avoid Nicolot by keeping Amira between them, but it wasn't easy. He snuck closer every chance he got. "Lamone's pretty angry with me," Nicolot said as they followed Amira across the lawn to the stables. Amira was running ahead of them, and KaLeah just didn't have the energy to run after her. "I may have to find a new best friend." "You shouldn't have promised him something that wasn't yours to give," KaLeah said. "That's right," he said. "I guess he should have gone to my sister. He'll have to ask her for you from now on, I guess." KaLeah resisted the urge to punch the prince in the nose. She clenched her fists together and spoke through gritted teeth. "I am the only one who will ever give myself to anyone, Your Highness," KaLeah said. She put some effort into walking faster. When he tried to keep up, she took off into a run, although the food in her stomach protested. She was used to punching boys in the village. She was used to standing her ground and speaking her mind. But she knew that in this castle, she was far from her village in more ways than one. If a prince could so casually offer to sell her to a stranger, she could only imagine the punishment for standing up to him. In the stable, a boy younger than KaLeah was putting a saddle on Amira's tall white draggot, while she stood by and wrung her hands impatiently.
Hurry and saddle up the golden mare, KaLeah, she said. Her name is Maze.
KaLeah didn't need to be told to hurry. She wanted to get back out of the stable and away from Nicolot, hopefully outrunning him on her draggot. Maze kicked the stall door with her hoof excitedly as she approached. "I'm coming, girl," KaLeah said as she let the draggot out and threw the saddle over her. Nicolot entered the stable, and KaLeah heard Amira yell at him to hurry up. She smiled at the child's lack of patience. KaLeah lifted herself up and saw that Amira had also mounted her draggot. The girls tore out of the stable, leaving Nicolot in their dust. For someone with no experience riding draggots, KaLeah found it came naturally. They had only trotted slowly that day. She had emerged from the woods with Amira. Moving now at a much faster pace, she stood up slightly in her stirrups, easing the bumpiness until she reached a rhythm with the draggot, where she was almost gliding across the grass. The castle grounds were quiet. A few fat wovots were grazing on the lawn, their scales along their backs inherited from their dragon ancestors glistened in the sunlight. The Woovots lifted their big, lazy eyeballs up at KaLeah and Amira as they ran by on their draggots. The only sound was the rhythmic beating of the clawed hooves on the ground below her and the princess's draggots. In the distance, KaLeah could hear the flying julebis singing from the border of the woods. There was a great field that stretched out for miles in front of the castle. To the east were farmlands and a road leading to the towns that surrounded the southeast side of the castle. To the north and west were thick forests, and the mountains beyond that. The mountains to the very south of the castle were visible from some of the rooms, including her own. Although she yearned to run off for miles with the draggot, she knew that the lawn would be all the ground they would cover today. KaLeah heard draggot hooves approaching. She turned her head around and saw Nicolot gaining on them. She was annoyed by his presence and rolled her eyes. "KaLeah!" he yelled. She pretended not to hear him. "KaLeah, I just thought you'd want to know that you were in my dream last night." That got her attention, but she didn't slow her draggot down. He caught up to her anyway, and the three of them all slowed down. "Don't you want to know about it?" he asked. She tried hard not to look at him. Anytime she did, she found herself immobilized by his gaze and confounded by a mix of feelings. "I do," Amira said, circling her draggot back toward them. Nicolot took that as his cue and started to tell them the dream. "KaLeah, you were riding on top of a large dragon and wearing ancient warrior garb like the warriors in the tapestry murals." KaLeah's heart started to flutter nervously. A tightness clenched her chest. It was the same feeling she had when she had realized her father was missing. The same feeling she had before the men had come upon her in the woods. Danger. She said nothing and saw Amira crinkle up her nose. "That's it?" Amira asked. "That was the dream?" Nicolot looked stricken. "Well, yes," he said. He turned back to look at KaLeah. "Maybe you don't know this since you are from a village, but here in the kingdom, we grow up hearing stories about the dragon spirits helping warriors win battles hundreds of years ago. It said that the spirits would take physical form and the warriors could ride them into battle. Of course, only men are warriors, so you being in the dream doesn't really make sense." He kept his eyes locked tightly on KaLeah while he told her, and she tried her best to keep her eyes on the back of her draggot's neck while she stroked its furry mane. "I don't normally have dreams, let alone remember details like this," he continued after a brief pause. "But there you were, riding on the back of one as it flew over the kingdom grounds, its green scales shimmering in the light of the sun." KaLeah's eyes shot up and met his involuntarily. She could picture that dragon because she'd seen it before, the phantom dragon from the field. Maybe it was a coincidence, she told herself. She tried to remember the colors of the dragons depicted in the tapestries. Were there a lot of green ones? She wondered. Maybe they were all green. While her mind tried to work things out, a slow grin started to stretch across Nicolot's face. He was looking at her intently now, and she realized he and his draggot had come much closer to her over the last few moments. What if he had just overheard her telling Princess Amira about her own dream that morning, and he was just trying to use that to win her over? Her eyes narrowed as this realization set in, and a low growl sounded in the back of her mind like a warning. KaLeah was just about to tell him that she wasn't interested in hearing about any more of his dreams when a shrill scream filled the air, accompanied by the sound of hooves. KaLeah knew immediately that there were many sets of hooves. Her eyes darted around the castle grounds and she saw that Amira was gone. She had trotted toward the direction of the forest. Amira's draggot galloped back toward them fast, with Amira tucked low and leaning forward against her draggot's neck. Good girl, KaLeah thought as she kicked Maze into a gallop toward Amira. There were 3 men on draggots following close behind Amira. They didn't appear to be running full speed, and they had their swords drawn. They probably hadn't expected Amira to run off so quickly when they emerged from behind the trees. KaLeah was fuming. These men had caught them all off guard. KaLeah passed Amira and then brought Maze to a stop to face the attackers. She pulled out her sword and turned Maze so the men could see the sword in her right hand. KaLeah could see their faces. They showed no signs of emotion. The three men were running almost perfectly parallel to each other. All three were dressed in blue and green uniforms of the Lycedanian army. She stared hard at the man in the middle, keeping the man to the left of him in her peripheral view. Just as they were about to plow into KaLeah, she kicked Maze into action, and with her sword extended, she ran around the men and sliced her sword down across the chest of the man on the end. He groaned and fell off his draggot. The man in the middle of the group spun his draggot around to face KaLeah, while the third kept on course for Amira. KaLeah charged the second attacker, but he held his ground, waiting for her. She leaned over toward the right with her sword extended. He was waiting with his sword extended on the right side of his draggot. It would be a clean duel, but she had a trick planned. She lined up Maze's nose with the assassin's draggot so that it appeared she would run into him head on. At the last second, she veered to the right, threw her sword over to her left hand, then stabbed the gawking assassin in the side. KaLeah held onto her sword tightly. As Maze kept moving forward, KaLeah pulled the sword out of the attacker, causing him to spin around and fall off his draggot. She kicked Maze lightly, realizing the draggot responded almost instinctively with KaLeah's plans, as if trained for battle. Maze must be used to having a fighter on her back, she thought, as it kept running full speed back toward Amira. Up ahead, Nicolot and the last assassin were sword fighting from the tops of their draggots, and Nicolot was doing well. The attempted assassin or kidnapper kept trying to break free and get around to Amira, who was scowling from her draggot behind Nicolot. "Get back to the castle, princess," KaLeah yelled, annoyed to see the child lingering there. Amira only casually directed her draggot backward, as KaLeah turned to help Nicolot dispatch the attacker. He must have known he was beaten because he started to lash out with his sword chaotically. KaLeah and Nicolot had him pinned between them, and he tried frantically to maneuver his draggot out of the trap. The man widened his eyes, and his features softened. He stopped fighting as if he were preparing to surrender. He turned his dark eyes to KaLeah. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, Nicolot's sword struck him through his back and out his chest. He bent over without making a sound and then fell from his draggot. His sword landed on the ground beside him. The expression on Nicolot's face was serious when he looked up at KaLeah. "We were going to win. You didn't have to kill him," KaLeah said. "Now we won't find out why they came or who sent them." "He attacked my sister," he said, nonchalantly, as he wiped the blood off his sword onto his pant leg. "Besides, did you let the men live who attacked you the day you rescued Amira?" "That was different. I was alone." She turned to the sounds of guards on draggots coming from the castle. "I didn't have an entire army just a few moments away to assist me in taking them captive," she continued. Amira came up beside KaLeah on her draggot. "And why are you still here?" KaLeah asked incredulously. "You were in a full run. You should have kept going until you were behind the castle portcullis." "I knew you and my brother would protect me," Amira responded. "You're so good at sword fighting on a draggot." KaLeah's jaw was hanging open. No wonder the child had been previously abducted. She was careless. "How did you learn to fight like that?" Prince Nicolot asked her. "Did you have draggots in your village?" KaLeah shut her jaw and shook her head. "My father taught me to sword fight, but I've never had a draggot. It's obvious that Maze knows how to respond to my slightest suggestions, which made my movements effortless. It all seemed very natural to me, I suppose." "Like a warrior on a dragon," Nicolot said, smiling wryly again. "Warrior KaLeah has saved me again," the princess chirped. The castle guards were almost upon them, and KaLeah didn't feel like being either praised or questioned. She had an unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach that something was amiss. KaLeah lightly nudged Maze into a gallop, past the assassins lying on the ground, and toward the edge of the forest. She saw something glimmer between the trees. Her adrenaline began pumping hard through her veins, and she ducked her head as they shot straight for the forest. She thought she heard Nicolot yell something from behind her, but his words died before they reached her ears. KaLeah plunged into the dense forest, looking for her prey. If there was someone hiding there, she was going to find him.